purpose of this video you're watching is to model how I would approach an analysis of this poem called A Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes, primarily to not only help us analyze poetry and to increase our skills of analyzing a text, but also most importantly is to help us prepare for the written portion of our final, something that will be very similar to this quick write experience that we're going to go through in this video. So if you're watching this at home, hopefully this is a great study tool as we get closer and closer to finals week. So with a poem, it's often difficult to understand what the author is attempting to say. So we like to use this graphic organizer called TP-Fast, and T stands for title, and this is where we're going to start. Before we even read the poem, we're making a prediction about what we think the poem is going to be about based on its title. Now, a dream deferred, I know what dreams refer to, maybe things that we're sleeping, but also maybe the more abstract concept of hopes and aspirations rather than just dreaming while we're sleeping. And deferred is a word that maybe we have or have not heard before, but deferred means to put off or to abandon. So I'm thinking that this poem is going to be about aspirations that have been left behind or abandoned by the dreamer. That's my guess, okay? Now I need to actually read the poem. I'm going to paraphrase it, but before I do that I need to actually mark the text. So I'm not only going to help highlight under things or underline things that stand out to me to help increase my understanding, but I'm also going to look for those literary devices, the lids we've been discussing in class. So images, detail, diction, and syntax. So starting here, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Okay. So I'm already noticing a couple things. First off, the poem starts with a question. And I'm going to make a note of that here. And it continues to ask questions as we continue on. So we can see that the poem actually has 5 questions in a row before it goes to a typical sentence, and then it actually ends with the question. So of the 7 sentences that make up this poem, 5 of them, the majority of them are questions. That's really important for us to recognize. And I noticed that it asks the question, what happens to a dream deferred or a dream abandoned? And it lists all of these possibilities. So to kind of help me understand what the superficial meaning of the poem is, just paraphrasing it, I might say something like, the poem attempts to answer the question, what happens when aspirations are abandoned? Okay. And then also it lists possibilities of what could happen to those dreams or aspirations when they are left behind. Okay, and so then we also want to focus specifically on the literary devices, the figurative language. We've already found questions, right? But let's look for more literary devices in our reading here. I definitely see a personification, and then run. I see simile, like a raisin in the sun. I see another simile, like a syrupy sweet. Here we go again, another simile, sags like a heavy load. Further questions, and this is also a fragment. I'm going to make a note of that. In fact, we have another fragment here. So lots of fragments, as well as questions. Oops, and it looks like I missed a simile here. And then I'm not seeing anything else, like a sore, another simile. And I also want to make a note that it ends with a question. So we also can notice that the poem starts with a question and then ends with a question. So I'm going to call that circular pattern. If you remember, that takes place in our story of Mice and Men. So not only do I have questions, but I also have circular pattern, sentence fragments or incomplete sentences, similes, and personification. Okay, so these are all going to be critical in helping us analyze this text a little bit further. I want to come back to attitude. We're going to get there in just a second, but let's start with shift as we continue on. So this is where any kind of changes occur, any abrupt transitions. So let's go ahead and look back at the poem. I'm looking at the stanzas. Stanzas are kind of like paragraphs that consist of a poem. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas. And you notice the second one is the largest one. And that's kind of a shift. So it goes from a short question into a series of longer questions. Oops, wrong column. So I'm going to say the first stanza starts with a short question and then shifts into a longer series of questions. And then after the second stanza, we see another shift back to a shorter stanza, this time in the form of a complete sentence. Then the final shift occurs when the last stanza is a fragmented sentence. So we can see how the author's changing over the course of the poem. Complete question, series of questions and fragments, complete sentence, and then a fragmented question. So to help us understand the attitude of the author, we have to look more closely at those shifts as well as the figurative language that we just identified. So I do want to start with the fact that Langston Hughes compares it, or the dream that he's referring to a raisin in the sun. So some things you might want to consider when we think about raisins. They used to be grapes. Raisins are the former state of a grape, and in the case that the raisin has dried up. All the juice is gone when it's out in the sun. So before it was ripe, it was healthy, it was juicy, and then in the sun, now that it's been abandoned, it becomes a raisin. It's lost all of that health, all of that juice that was originally in the grape. It's interesting comparison to a dream. Thinking about it, the dream before it was deferred or abandoned was once healthy, was once full and full of promise, like a delicious grape. But once it becomes a raisin, it's lost all of that excitement that it formerly had. But what about a sore? We don't only have a simile here, but we have a personification as well as a fragment. Fester is a really great example of diction. So I'm actually going to make a note. We have some diction here. Fester means to not heal, right? Like a sore that festers means it continues to be unhealthy. It is not in a healed state like a scab would be if you got a scratch on your arm. So it continues to be an open wound. And then even more interesting is in that personification and then run. Obviously the sore isn't literally running. What Hughes is referring to here is that when a sore festers and doesn't heal, the blood and the scab and all that stuff, it builds up and then runs over like a puss, rotten sore, a wound that just does not heal. It spreads, right? The nastiness in the sore bubbles over and spreads out. It's a really graphic image here that maybe you didn't catch on the first time you read this. So why would he compare a dream to a sore that festers and then runs, builds up and spreads? It's nastiness, right? It started out as just a simple wound, but has built up and kind of over time, it just continues to become worse. So when a dream is not fulfilled, it's like a sore that can't heal. So it's a pretty graphic image there. So let's move on to the next one. Stink like rotten meat, another kind of gross comparison here. We think about rotten meat. It was once good. It was once edible. But when it becomes rotten, it stinks. It's no longer edible. Kind of like if a dream has been abandoned, it is no longer achievable, right? It goes bad. It expires like meat. And then another food example here, like a syrupy sweet, crust or sugar over. If you've ever made pancakes at home and you accidentally spilled some syrup on your counter, if you do not clean it up right away, it hardens, it crusts over, and makes it really, really difficult to get off the counter when you do go back to clean it. Actually, it becomes almost impossible to get off because it's become so crusty and hard. In the same way, a dream, if it's abandoned, if it's left, if it's not taken care of and fulfilled, it never goes away. It continues to haunt the person who had that dream. So some really interesting ideas here so far. And then the last simile here, we have like a heavy load. I like to think of the word load as like a burden, like the dream that is unfulfilled is a burden. Thinking it back to that syrupy sweet comparison, here we have something that never goes away. It crusts over. It can never be removed. And that becomes a burden to the person who dreams of that dream and then never fulfills it. And then we have the circular pattern here, right? This is so important because it's in the form of a question. If you begin with a question, the reader assumes that eventually, by the end of this text, we should answer that question, but that does not happen. It ends with a question, therefore meaning that the answer was never achieved, the dream was never achieved, and never will be. It's also important to consider the idea that Hughes asks, or does it explode? When we think about an explosion, many people want to say, oh, the dream disappears. But in an explosion, when things are blown up, like a building, the building itself is destroyed, but bits and pieces of it remain. And those pieces can never be put back together. In the same way that a dream that has been abandoned, or in this case exploded metaphorically, it can never be put back together, or never can be returned to and fulfilled. So what is the author's tone or attitude here? We have to consider the topic at hand, which is dreams. So what is the author's attitude towards dreams? I would say the author feels a sense of futility or hopelessness about dreams. And this is because those bits of figurative language the author chooses to use, those are really negative connotations. Explosions, pieces can never be put back together. It crusts over, it can never be removed. It's a burden to the dreamer. All of these negative connotations with that figurative language that the author provides definitely formulate that futility. So the author definitely feels hopeless about dreams in general. So now that we've kind of broken down and analyzed the poem, what does the poem really mean? A dream deferred. Dreams can be abandoned, and with that come devastating consequences, or you could even say unanswered questions. So what lesson do we take away? What's the theme here? That dreams must either be fulfilled or abandoned. If they are abandoned, the pursuit of the dream is hopeless and can never be returned to or fulfilled, right? Definitely kind of the emphasis that Hughes is trying to make about dreams that are abandoned. So that's our end of this video that is analyzing the poem. The next video you'll see is going to cover the quick write prompt and how we're going to synthesize this poem with Of Mice and Men. So stay tuned for that.